Well, it happened again. And this time, Tani Adewumi's victory against Hikaru Nakamura was even smoother than last time. Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery, and I hope you enjoyed this game. This was a blitz game played on chess.com versus Tani Adewumi and Hikaru's account, GM Hikaru on Twitch, but this is Hikaru Nakamura. And we get to see Tani and Hikaru play again. This is becoming a habit here. Let's watch and see. Tani Adewumi has the white pieces. Hikaru Nakamura has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. Tani plays e4. Hikaru responds with the Scandinavian or center counter defense. Pawn takes, queen takes d5. So the queen is in the middle of the board, and the queen can get kicked around. This used to be thought to not be a very good opening, but it's considered playable today. Knight to c3, queen to a5, d4. This is all book. c6. This adds to some control over d5, allows the queen at a5 to tuck back on c7 if it needs to. Knight to f3, and then bishop to f5. The normal move here is knight to f6, but bishop f5 is a bit of Hikaru Nakamura's specialty. He plays this quite a bit. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not exactly sure why. It seems a little bit inflexible because the bishop could go to g4. You don't really know yet. But he plays it, has success with it, and maybe it's just to throw his opponent off balance. Tani immediately plays bishop d3. Another more common option is bishop to c4 to aim at the f7 square after, say, a move like knight to e5, attack f7. But he immediately challenges the bishop at f5, trying to get it off the board. Hikaru plays e6. Now, this is really the reason why you play the Scandinavian. Black has these pawns at e6 and c6 with the half-open d file, and what this is basically a Caro-Kann structure. So black gets into a Caro-Kann structure without having to deal with all the theory of the advanced variation and the fantasy variation and all that stuff. The only downside is your queen can get kicked around a little bit. Bishop takes f5. More common moves are castling or knight to e5. Bishop takes f5. Queen takes f5. Now, the problem for Tani to take the bishop is that he's moving his bishop twice to capture a bishop that's only moved once. It turns out that it's not too big of a problem, but that's what's happened. Now Tani castles, and knight to d7. Now, the computers slightly like white in this position, but in the database, black has a huge plus score. It's like 78% of the games black wins from this position. I don't know why there's a disconnect there. It's probably just familiarity. Black knows the position a bit better, the players that play it. But black has a huge plus score. Nakamura's position scores very well. So Tani plays rook to e1, putting the rook opposite the king. The computers show us that the most accurate move here is d5. And in a center counter as white or Scandinavian, d5 is your first main goal. If you can get this move through, then you should do it. It works here for a couple of reasons. Black takes with the c-pawn, then knight to b5, threatening knight to c7, check with the fork. Rook to c8 covers that, but then the knight takes the a7 pawn. After, say, rook to d8, black can bring the knight back. The knight can go to d4, hitting the queen. Black's king is still in the middle of the board. If instead he takes with the e-pawn, then rook to e1 check, say you block with the bishop, knight e2 to shift the knight over to g3 and attack the queen with tempo. And if an obvious move like knight g to f6 actually loses because knight to g3 hits the queen, and when the queen moves, knight to h4 hits the queen again, the knight will come into f5 and hit the e7 bishop, and that will be that. The other option, the better option, is long castling, but after bishop e3, aiming at the a7 pawn, white has a strong position, even though he is a pawn down. So Tani plays rook to e1, still a very natural move. Knight g to f6, knight to e5. Now here, Nakamura plays a novelty, and that novelty turns out to be a mistake. He takes the knight on e5, and this allows Tani's rook to become just incredibly strong. It becomes a real problem for black. Black's already in trouble because of the activity of this rook on e5. Naka plays queen to g6. Now, Tani has a really nice tactical shot here. You can pause the video if you want to try to guess what it is. And he plays it rook to g5. This forces the queen to h6, and now, boom, he plays rook to b5. The bishop at c1 attacks the queen at h6. The rook at b5 attacks the pawn at b7. Nakamura has to lose material already. Queen goes back to g6. Rook takes b7. Bishop to d6. Now, black's only real chance now, he's down material, is to maybe generate some sort of kingside pressure, knight g4, h5, something of this nature, because long term, being down that pawn, he's in trouble. Queen to f3, aiming at the c6 pawn. He castles, and bishop to e3. He completes development before he rushes to grab that material on c6. He does leave the c2 pawn hanging, which Nakamura takes that, but that allows Tani's rook to become active at c1. Rook to c1 hitting the queen. The queen goes back to g6, and now queen to c6. So white stays ahead of material. He takes the c6 pawn. The queen is threatening the bishop on d6, so black has to do something about that. Rook f to d8, defending the bishop. The queen comes back to f3. Rook a to c8. Now that gives up the a7 pawn over here, but he's trying to get his pieces as active as possible. You know, he knows a long-term endgame is not going to be good for him. Nakamura knows that. So he wants to get his pieces as active as possible. Tani goes ahead and takes the pawn, and now he's got those beautiful a2 and b2 pawns that can advance in the endgame. Tani is winning, and he is in control. The question now is, can he deal with Nakamura's pressure and get the win? So Nakamura plays h5. Gains space on the king side, gives a way to support a knight, maybe coming into g4. So Tani immediately plays h3 to help control that g4 square, keep a piece from landing on it. Bishop to b4, pressing down on the knight at c3. Rook to b7, attacking the bishop, takes. And now he's got these two pawns in the middle of the board and the passed a pawn. And Nakamura has one more chance to really complicate matters. White's still better, but his best move here is probably queen to d3. This is the computer's advice. He basically puts the queen in the middle of the action and makes it harder for white to advance his pawns. But instead, he plays knight to e4. And now Tani is in control. First thing he does is he advances his c-pawn, begins to move that forward to try to queen it. The knight goes to d6, which attacks the rook at b7 as well as the pawn on c4. So Tani moves the rook and defends the pawn at c4. Knight to f5. Now he's attacking the pawn on d4 with the rook and the knight. So c5. That unveils the defense of the rook at b4. So now the d4 pawn is protected. Knight to e7. He wants to put that knight on d5, which is a strong square for the knight. It's not worth two pawns, but it would make the knight better than the bishop. So Tani presses ahead with c6, knight to d5, rook to b7. The rook on b7 helps support the pawn, advancing to the queening square, and also puts pressure on f7, where the queen and the rook would meet. f7 is sufficiently defended now, but it just makes black worry about the pressure on that square. Hikaru plays rook to a8, aiming at the a2 pawn. Tani plays rook to c5. He knows he's going to have to do something about that knight on d5, and even if he has to give up the exchange later, he's going to need to do that to help get that c-pawn all the way to the queening square. Rook d to c8. Now what happens if Nakamura takes the pawn on a2? Rook a2, c7, advancing the pawn, then if rook to c8, then the exchange sack, rook takes, pawn takes, rook to b8. Now here's a really cool combination the computers see. Right now, of course, white's threatening rook takes rook. So queen to e6 protects the rook, and watch this. Queen takes d5. That is an incredible move. So after queen takes, rook takes with check, king to h7, and then rook to d8. The rook attacks the queen and allows the pawn to advance after, say, queen c4. And then the pawn queens, white's up a pawn and a piece, and the game would be over. So instead, Nakamura plays rook d to c8, and then the pawn advances. The queen finally goes to d3, but it's a little bit too late. So now, how does Tani Adewumi get that c-pawn all the way through? Well, he begins by giving up the exchange for a knight and a pawn. if you count the position, he actually has 3 pawns for the exchange, so he's still materially up, but the real issue is that c pawn that's so far advanced. The queen goes to c2 to aim at that pawn. Queen to d7 to defend the pawn. Queen takes a2, and now d5. He wants to connect those 2 pawns and have them work together to advance. Queen to a1 check, king to h2, queen to e5 check. Hikaru would love to get a perpetual check in a position like this. g3 blocking the check, and now h4. And it looks like, white has to be careful. Tani has to watch out here for tricks. Bishop to f4, hitting the queen, and as it turns out, there was a move here that would have saved the game for Nakamura, that would have equalized, and that move was queen to d4, aiming at the f2 pawn, so that when the bishop came back to e3, then hg, and that's with check, so you can't take the queen. Then after king g3, then queen e5, and say bishop f4, rook a3 check, f3, queen to e1, king g4, and he gets a perpetual, queen g1, bishop g3, and back and forth. So that was a chance to save the position, but he had the same idea, but he got the move order backwards, and that makes all the difference in the world. He actually takes on g3 first. Then bishop takes g3. That was the real difference. So the queen goes to e4. Now there are mating possibilities at h1 that Tani has to worry about. The rook at a8 can go to a1, and the queen or the rook could mate on h1 if he's not careful. So he plays rook to b8, and now rook to a1. You can't take the rook, because then takes, your queen takes, and then the bishop would take. The bishop on g3 defends that final square, and here white has way too much material again. So Nakamura plays rook to a1 to threaten mate on h1. So how does white get out of this threat and win the game? Well, Tani comes up with a great idea. First, he takes the rook that's being offered at c8 with check. Then king to h7. So now, how does Tani stop black's mate threat on h1? First, he plays rook to h8 check, giving back the rook. If the king takes, then you promote to a queen, forcing the king back to h7, and then queen to f5 check, and that takes queens off the board. And of course, that would be decisive. But instead, Nakamura plays king to g6, and then, boom, queen to g4 check. And Nakamura resigned in this position after queen g4, which would be forced because it's hitting the queen and the king simultaneously. You take, and obviously, that's the end of the game. He would have to give up his rook for the remaining pawn at c7. Game over. So this is another impressive win by Tani over Nakamura, and this time it's a bit smoother. He's looking better and better every single day. I hope you've enjoyed this game. Join us again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.